Before we begin the story, let us know where you're watching from by leaving a comment below. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the story. The grandfather clock in the corner of their honeymoon suite chimed midnight, its deep, resonant tone echoing through the silence that had settled between them like a wall made of ice. Amara Elise Cartershea still couldn't believe that was her name, now sat on the edge of the king-sized bed, her wedding dress pulled around her feet like spilled moonlight. The intricate beadwork, which had taken months to complete by hand, caught the soft lamplight, each crystal telling a story of dreams she'd harbored since childhood dreams that felt as fragile as glass tonight. Nathan Carter stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his broad shoulders rigid beneath his white dress shirt. He'd discarded his jacket hours ago, along with the practiced smile he'd worn throughout their wedding reception. The city lights of Manhattan stretched endlessly before him, but his reflection in the glass was what held his attention, the face of a man who felt trapped by his own choices, suffocated by expectations that had been placed on his shoulders since birth. The wedding had been everything society would call perfect. 300 guests from New York's most elite families, flowers that cost more than most people's annual salaries, and a bride so stunning that even the jaded society photographers had stopped their relentless clicking to simply stare. Amara had walked down the aisle of St. Patrick's Cathedral with grace that concealed the trembling in her hands, her rich brown skin luminous against the ivory silk, her natural hair woven into an intricate crown of braids adorned with baby's breath and tiny pearls. But perfection, Amara had learned that day, was often just a beautiful lie. "We need to discuss something." Nathan's voice cut through the silence, low and controlled. He turned from the window, and Amara felt her breath catch. Even with the coldness in his stormy gray eyes, he was devastatingly handsome. 6'3" of sharp angles and controlled power, with aristocratic features that belonged on magazine cover-strong jaw, high cheekbones, and eyes that reminded her of thunderclouds. She'd fallen for those eyes 6 months ago at her father's clinic, when this stranger had listened to her speak about sickle cell research with genuine fascination. That felt like a lifetime ago now. Amara's hand smoothed over the silk of her dress, a nervous habit she'd developed whenever she felt cornered. "What is it?" Her voice was softer than she'd intended, revealing more vulnerability than she wanted to show. She'd been Amara Elise Thompson for 26 years, a brilliant medical researcher with 3 degrees and a backbone of steel. But tonight, she felt as fragile as the antique lace on her sleeves. Nathan's jaw tightened, and for a moment, something flickered across his features. Was it regret? Pain? But it was gone so quickly that Amara wondered if she'd imagined it. When he spoke, his words were measured, deliberate, each one falling like a stone into the quiet room. "This marriage serves both our families' needs," Nathan began, his voice steady. "My parents need me settled, continuing the Carter legacy. Your father needs financial backing for his clinic." He paused, running a hand through his dark hair. "But I need you to understand something about my family's expectations." The word expectations landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of dread through Amara's chest. She'd known this marriage was arranged, had agreed to save her father's struggling practice. But she'd harbored hope that affection might grow between them, especially after their thoughtful conversations during courtship. "I'm listening," she managed. Nathan moved closer, and she caught his expensive cologne, something that reminded her of old money and older burdens. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of generations. "My family has carried a legacy for over a century, Amara. When my brother Liam died," his jaw tightened, old pain flickering across his features, "I made promises to him, to my parents, to preserve what we've built. I need an heir, someone to carry forward everything we've sacrificed for." Amara's hands clenched. "Nathan, what are you saying?" "I'm saying I need certainty." His eyes met hers, and she saw desperation poorly disguised as control. "If you don't give me a baby within 1 year, I'll divorce you without a second thought." The words hit her like a physical assault. Amara felt the color drain from her face, felt her carefully constructed composure crumble like sand between her fingers. She stared at him, searching for any sign that this was some kind of cruel joke. But Nathan's expression remained impassive, cold as winter marble. "A year," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. 12 months, he confirmed, checking his expensive watch. as if time had already begun ticking away her worth as a wife. That should be more than sufficient. My mother had my sister within 10 months of marriage. Amara's hands clenched in her lap, her nails digging into her palms hard enough to leave marks. She thought of her mother, who died when Amara was 12, who taught her that love was supposed to be gentle, nurturing, unconditional. She thought of her father, whose eyes had filled with tears of gratitude when Nathan's family had offered to save the clinic. She thought of all the patients who depended on that clinic, all the children who would go without medical care if it closed. And if I can't? The question tore from her throat like broken glass. Nathan's expression didn't change. Then you'll have served your purpose, and we'll both be free to move on with our lives. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Amara felt something inside her chest crack, a hairline fracture that she knew would never quite heal. She looked down at her hands, at the diamond ring that felt more like a shackle than a symbol of love, and tried to process what her life had just become. She was 26 years old, brilliant, accomplished, and she'd just been reduced to nothing more than a breeding mare. "I see," she said finally, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Years of medical training had taught her to remain calm under pressure, to compartmentalize emotion when lives were at stake. She'd never imagined she'd need those skills in her own marriage. Nathan seemed to expect an argument, a fight, tears, something other than her quiet acceptance. He shifted uncomfortably, and for the first time that evening, he looked uncertain. "Amara, I know." She stood gracefully, every movement controlled and dignified despite the chaos raging in her heart. "You've made yourself perfectly clear. A business arrangement with terms and conditions. I understand." She moved toward the bathroom, needing space, needing air, needing anywhere but near this man who just shattered every naive hope she'd harbored. At the door, she paused, her hand on the crystal handle. "Just so we're clear, Nathan," she said, without turning around, "if you get your heir within the year, don't expect anything else from me. You'll have your child and your legacy, but you'll never have my heart. You made sure of that tonight." She disappeared into the bathroom, closing the door softly behind her, and Nathan was left alone with the weight of his words and the sudden, inexplicable feeling that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. In the bathroom, Amara Elise Cartergod, would she ever get used to that name, finally allowed herself to break. She slid down the marble wall, her wedding dress a cloud of broken dreams around her, and wept for the marriage that had ended before it had truly begun. Chapter 2. Strangers in the same house. Living in shadows. 7 months. 7 months of existing like elegant strangers in a house that showcased wealth but harbored no warmth. Amara marked each day on the calendar beside her desk, watching time slip away like sand through her fingers. The irony cut deep. She lived in a mansion worth more than some nations' treasuries, yet felt more impoverished than she ever had in her father's modest apartment above the clinic. The Carter estate in the Hamptons was everything old money could buy. Sprawling manicured lawns, a pool that looked like it belonged in a resort, staff quarters for the small army of people who kept the place running like clockwork. Amara had her own wing. Nathan had insisted on that the day after their wedding, claiming they both needed space to adjust. She knew it was really because he couldn't stand the sight of her after what had transpired on their wedding night. This morning, like every morning since their wedding, Amara made her way to the sunroom she'd claimed as her sanctuary. Nathan had offered her any room in the sprawling estate. She'd chosen this one for its eastern light and the way dawn made even despair look hopeful. Her laptop hummed quietly as she reviewed trial data, her coffee cooling beside journals from Columbia University, where she'd completed her doctoral work. She'd been working on her sickle cell anemia research with a desperation that had nothing to do with scientific curiosity and everything to do with survival. The work was her anchor, the one thing that still belonged entirely to her in this strange new life. Her laptop hummed quietly as she reviewed the latest trial data, her coffee growing cold beside a stack of medical journals that had arrived from Columbia University, where she'd completed her postdoctoral work. Dr. Carter. The voice belonged to Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, the head housekeeper who'd been with the Carter family for 30 years. She was a kind woman in her 60s, with silver hair always pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Carter asked me to remind you about the charity gala tonight." Amara's fingers froze on her keyboard. She'd completely forgotten evidence of how this hollow marriage had scattered her usually meticulous mind. Before Nathan, she'd been ruthlessly organized. Now, she felt constantly off balance, bracing for emotional impact. "Of course," Amara said, closing her laptop. "Thank you, Mrs. Brooks." The older woman hesitated in the doorway, and Amara caught the maternal concern in her eyes. "Ma'am, if I may, you've been working yourself awfully hard lately. Perhaps you should take some time to rest before tonight." It was the closest Mrs. Brooks had come to acknowledging the obvious tension in the house. The staff had to notice that the newlyweds barely spoke, that they ate at different times, that Nathan often didn't come home until well past midnight. But discretion was part of their job, just as pretending everything was normal had become part of Amara's. "I'm fine, Mrs. Brooks, truly. Just passionate about my work." The housekeeper nodded, but Amara caught the worried look she cast back as she left. It seemed everyone in the house was walking on eggshells, afraid to acknowledge the elephant in every room, that this marriage was a beautiful disaster. Amara returned to her research, but the calendar's red marks haunted her peripheral vision. 7 months down, 5 months remaining. 7 months of carefully choreographed encounters designed to fulfill Nathan's ultimatum, each one feeling more clinical than the last. Until recently, something had shifted after the charity gala incident 3 weeks ago, when Nathan had seen her stumble during her acceptance speech due to exhaustion. He'd caught her arm to steady her, and instead of his usual polite distance, she'd seen genuine concern. Since then, he'd been different, not warm exactly, but present in ways that confused her. The sound of a car in the driveway interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Through the window, she watched Nathan's black Tesla pull up to the front entrance. He was home earlier than usual. Normally, he stayed at his Manhattan office until well past dinner. Amara found herself watching as he emerged from the car, his movements sharp with exhaustion. Nathan Carter had inherited his family's technology empire at 28, when his father suffered a massive heart attack. 2 years later, he'd turned a profitable company into a tech giant, but the success had come at a cost. Amara had noticed the way his shoulders seemed to carry the weight of the world, the way his jaw was perpetually tight with stress. She couldn't understand not that she'd tried very hard to understand. How could she when every conversation between them felt like navigating a minefield? 20 minutes later, Nathan appeared in the doorway of her sunroom. He'd changed from his usual sharp business suit into dark jeans and a gray sweater that made his eyes look like storm clouds. For a moment, something flickered across his face when he saw her surprise, maybe, or something that looked almost like appreciation. "You're still in here," he said, stepping into the room. "Mrs. Brooks said you've been working since dawn." Amara saved her document before looking up. "My research doesn't keep business hours. What are you working on?" The question surprised them both. In 6 months of marriage, Nathan had never asked about her work, despite knowing she was a renowned researcher. Amara hesitated, studying his face for any sign of genuine interest or just polite conversation. "Sickle cell anemia. I'm trying to develop a gene therapy that could potentially cure the disease rather than just manage symptoms." Nathan moved closer, and Amara caught that scent again. Expensive cologne mixed with something uniquely him. "That's incredible work. How close are you to trials?" "Maybe 2 years. If funding continues." She paused, then added with a bitter edge, "Assuming I can continue my work, of course." The implication hung between them. If she didn't produce an heir in 6 months, she'd be divorced and out of this house. But more devastatingly, she'd lose access to the research funding that Nathan's family foundation provided to her father's clinic. Nathan's jaw tightened. "Amara, don't." She stood, closing her laptop with more force than necessary. "We both know where we stand. I don't need sympathy or regret from you, Nathan. I need results." She moved to brush past him, but he caught her arm gently. The contact sent an unwelcome shock through her system. Despite everything, her body still responded to his touch in ways that made her feel foolish and weak. "You know, that's not," he paused, seeming to struggle with words. "That's not how I wanted this to sound." Amara looked down at his hand on her arm, then back up to his face. For a moment, she saw something vulnerable in his expression, something that reminded her of the man who'd asked thoughtful questions about her research during their courtship. Then how did you want it to sound, Nathan? Her voice was quieter now, less defensive. Because from where I'm standing, it sounded exactly like what it was. A threat. His hand dropped from her arm, and the moment of connection evaporated. I was trying to be clear about expectations. Expectations? Amara shook her head. Do you know what I expected, Nathan? I expected that maybe, despite the arrangement, we could build something real. Something that looked like partnership, or at least respect. I expected that my husband might see me as more than a means to an end. Nathan's face went carefully blank, but Amara caught the flinch he tried to hide. I expected too much. She finished softly, then walked past him toward the door. The gala tonight. He called after her. We need to leave by 7. Amara paused in the doorway. Of course, another performance for the cameras. Don't worry, Nathan. I know my role. As she walked away, Nathan stood alone in the sunroom, surrounded by her research materials. The evidence of a brilliant mind, working to save lives, while her own life fell apart around her. For the first time in 6 months, he wondered if the cost of his family's legacy was too high. But the thought was gone as quickly as it came, buried under years of conditioning and the weight of expectations that felt heavier than love. That night, they would smile for the cameras and play the part of the perfect couple, but in the quiet spaces between the performance, they were still just two people who had forgotten how to reach for each other across the growing distance between them. Chapter 3. The Breakthrough. When Hearts Collide. The scream that shattered the Carter Mansion silence at 2:47 a.m. was pure terror given voice. It sent ice flooding Amara's veins and jolted her from the first deep sleep she'd managed in weeks. For a disorienting moment in the darkness, she wondered if she'd imagined it. Then she heard it again. Nathan's voice, but distorted by panic and the horrifying sound of airways closing. Amara's medical training kicked in before conscious thought could catch up. She was out of bed and running down the hallway in her silk pajamas, her bare feet silent on the Persian rugs. The sounds were coming from Nathan's bedroom, a room she'd never entered in their 7 months of marriage. Tonight, she didn't hesitate. Throwing open the door, the sight that greeted her made her blood run cold. Nathan lay collapsed beside his bed, his face already swelling with anaphylaxis, distorted, his breathing labored and wheezing. His normally sharp eyes were wide, with primal fear that only comes when your body turns against you in the most fundamental way. Nathan. Amara dropped to her knees beside him, her hands already moving to check his pulse. It was rapid and thready, not good. What happened? What did you eat? He tried to speak, but only a harsh wheeze emerged. His lips were beginning to take on a bluish tinge that made Amara's stomach clench with professional recognition and personal terror. She didn't want to examine too closely. Don't try to talk, she commanded, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. Where's your EpiPen? Nathan's hand flailed weakly toward the nightstand, and Amara lunged for it, yanking open drawers with increasingly desperate movements. Finally, in the bottom drawer, beneath some papers, she found the auto-injector. Her hands, trained by years of emergency medicine, were rock steady as she pulled off the safety cap. This is going to hurt, she warned, though she wasn't sure he could hear her anymore. His breathing was becoming more labored by the second. Without hesitation, she drove the needle through his pajama pants into his thigh, holding it there for the required 10 seconds while silently counting and praying to whatever deity might be listening. The effect wasn't immediate, and for terrifying seconds that felt like hours, Amara watched Nathan's face, searching for any sign that the epinephrine was working. She'd already pulled out her phone, ready to call 911, when his breathing began to ease just slightly. Better? She asked, her hand instinctively finding his forehead, checking for fever while offering comfort in the only way she knew how. Nathan nodded weakly, and some of the tension in Amara's shoulders began to ease, but she knew they weren't out of the woods yet. Anaphylaxis could have a second wave, and he needed proper medical attention. I'm calling an ambulance, she said, but Nathan's hand shot out to grab her wrist with surprising strength for someone who'd been dying minutes earlier. No, he whispered, his voice rough but clearer. No hospitals. Please. Amara stared at him. Nathan, you just had a severe allergic reaction. You need. I know what I need. His grip on her wrist tightened. I need you to stay with me. The vulnerability in his voice, the way he was looking at her like she was his lifeline, hit Amara somewhere deep in her chest. This wasn't the cold, calculating man who delivered an ultimatum on their wedding night. This was someone afraid and human, and completely dependent on her. "Okay," she said softly, "but we need to get you somewhere more comfortable, and I need to monitor you for the next few hours." Getting Nathan from the floor to his bed was an awkward dance of dead weight and determination. He was 6'3" of solid muscle, and the medication had left him shaky and weak. Amara found herself pressed against his side, his arm around her shoulders, her arm around his waist, closer to him than she'd been since their wedding night. Once he was settled against the pillows, Amara perched on the edge of the bed, her fingers automatically finding his pulse point. "Tell me what you ate." "Thai food," Nathan admitted, looking embarrassed. "I had a meeting that ran late, and there was this new place downtown. I thought I was being careful, but, Amara prompted, though she was already beginning to suspect. "I think there might have been peanuts in the sauce. I didn't think to ask." He closed his eyes, and Amara saw how young he looked without the armor of his usual composure. "I haven't had a reaction this severe since I was 12. Amara's medical mind was cataloging everything: his response time to the medication, the gradual improvement in his breathing, the way his color was slowly returning to normal. But another part of her, a part she'd been trying to ignore for months, was focused on the trust in his eyes when he looked at her. "Why no hospitals?" she asked quietly. "My brother died in a hospital," Nathan said finally, his voice barely audible. The words hit Amara like a physical blow. In all their conversations during courtship, all the family background checks before their arrangement, no one had mentioned a brother. Nathan, Liam. Nathan's eyes remained closed, but Amara could see decades of pain etched in his features. "He was 8. Leukemia. I was 10 when we lost him. Old enough to understand death, too young to understand why God would take someone so innocent." He opened his eyes then, and Amara saw grief so profound it stole her breath. "I held his hand when he died. This tiny kid who still believed his big brother could fix anything, and I couldn't save him. I promised him I'd take care of everything he was leaving behind. Our parents, the family legacy, the Carter name. That promise shaped every decision I've made since." Amara understood then. That's why the ultimatum. My parents never recovered from losing him. They threw themselves into preserving what Liam would never get to inherit, making sure the family name would continue through me since it couldn't through him. When Nathan's voice cracked, I thought I was honoring his memory. I didn't realize I was dishonoring yours. Amara felt something shift inside her chest, a crack in the wall of hurt and resentment she'd built around her heart. This didn't excuse his cruelty, but it explained it. The ultimatum hadn't been about control or possession. It had been about a promise made by a grieving 10-year-old to his dying brother. "You could have told me," she said softly. "How?" Nathan's laugh was bitter. "How do you tell someone you barely know that you're trapped by the ghost of a little boy who's been dead for 20 years? Amara was quiet for a long moment, processing this new information, trying to reconcile the cold man who'd threatened her with the broken boy who'd watched his brother die. "The doctors who treated Liam," she said finally. "Do you remember their names?" Nathan's eyes snapped to hers. "Why?" "Because one of them might have been my father." The silence that followed was so complete that Amara could hear Nathan's heartbeat, still elevated but steadying. She watched as understanding dawned in his eyes, as pieces of a puzzle 20 years in the making began to fall into place. "Your father," Nathan said slowly, "is Dr. Thompson. Dr. Samuel Thompson. Amara confirmed. He treated pediatric leukemia patients at Mount Sinai for 30 years before opening the clinic. Nathan, I think our marriage wasn't as random as we thought." But before Nathan could respond, before they could unpack the implications of this revelation, his breathing began to change again. Amara's attention snapped back to the immediate crisis as she recognized the signs of a secondary reaction. "We need that ambulance now," she said, reaching for her phone. This time, Nathan didn't protest. As Amara spoke rapidly to the 911 dispatcher, giving their address and Nathan's condition, she felt his hand find hers. Their fingers intertwined, and for the first time since their wedding night, the contact felt like connection rather than transaction. The ambulance arrived within minutes, and as the paramedics worked to stabilize Nathan for transport, Amara held his hand and made a decision that surprised them both. "I'm coming with you," she told him as they lifted the stretcher. Nathan's eyes widened. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." Amara's voice was firm, and something in her expression made Nathan stop protesting. "You saved my father's clinic. Tonight, I'm saving you." That's what partnerships look like. As the ambulance doors closed and they sped through the empty streets toward the hospital, Amara realized that somewhere between the panic and the revelation, between the medical crisis and the moment of vulnerability, something fundamental had shifted between them. They were still two people bound by arrangement rather than choice. But for the first time, they were also two people who had chosen to reach for each other in a moment of crisis. At Mount Sinai, 6 hours later, Nathan's hospital room was quiet, except for the steady beep of monitors and the soft whisper of oxygen flowing through his nasal cannula. The worst of the reaction had passed, but Dr. Lopez wanted to observe him overnight to ensure there wouldn't be a secondary response. Amara sat in the chair beside his bed, her hands still linked with his, watching the rise and fall of his chest with the vigilance of someone who'd nearly lost something precious. "You didn't have to stay," Nathan said softly, his voice still rough from the trauma his throat had endured. "Yes, I did." Amara's fingers tightened around his. "You asked me to. That's the first time you've ever asked me for anything instead of demanding it." Nathan turned his head to study her profile in the dim light, filtering through the window. Outside, Manhattan glittered like scattered diamonds, but inside this small room, the world had contracted to just the two of them. "Tell me about Liam," Amara said quietly. "Not the facts. Tell me about him." Nathan was silent for so long that Amara thought he might have fallen back asleep. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of 20 years of carefully buried grief. "He wanted to be a doctor, like you." Nathan's lips curved in a ghost of a smile. "He said he was going to specialize in pediatric oncology so he could help other kids like him. Even when he was dying, he was worried about the other children in the ward." Amara felt tears prick her eyes. "He sounds extraordinary." He was. Liam had this way of making everyone around him feel important. The nurses, the other patients, our parents, even me. When I felt useless watching him fight battles, I couldn't help him win. Nathan's voice cracked. "The night he died, he made me promise to take care of everyone he was leaving behind. I was 10 years old, and I promised my dying brother I'd fix everything." "Nathan," Amara whispered, beginning to understand the impossible weight he'd been carrying. "That's why the ultimatum," he continued, his words tumbling out like a dam had broken. "Not because I didn't care about you, but because I cared too much about keeping a promise to a dead child. I thought, if I could just secure the family legacy, if I could just make sure the Carter name continued, then Liam's death would have meant something." Amara lifted their joined hands to her lips, pressing a gentle kiss to his knuckles. "His death already meant something, Nathan. It taught you to love fiercely, even if you didn't know how to express it properly." Nathan's eyes filled with tears he'd held back for decades. "I reduced you to nothing more than a means to an end. I made you feel worthless when you're the most valuable thing in my life." "Not worthless," Amara corrected softly. "Afraid. You made me feel afraid that love always comes with conditions. But tonight, when you trusted me to save your life, when you chose vulnerability over control, that felt like love without conditions." They sat in silence, processing the weight of truth finally spoken. Outside their room, the hospital continued its endless rhythm of healing and hope. But inside, two people were learning what it meant to see each other clearly for the first time. "Amara," Nathan said, his voice barely audible. "What happens now?" She turned to meet his eyes, seeing not the cold businessman who delivered an ultimatum on their wedding night, but a man who'd been shaped by childhood trauma into someone who confused control with love. "Now, we learn how to be married to each other instead of to our fears," she said simply. Nathan brought their joined hands to his chest, over his heart that had nearly stopped beating hours earlier. "I want to learn. I want to be worthy of you." "You don't have to be worthy of me, Nathan. You just have to be honest with me." When he leaned forward to kiss her, it wasn't the desperate kiss of duty or arrangement. It was the tentative kiss of two people choosing to trust each other with their broken places. And when Amara kissed him back, she felt something she hadn't experienced since their wedding night, hope that their marriage might actually become real. It wasn't love note yet, but it was the first trembling note of a song that might eventually become beautiful. Chapter 4. Carrying Secrets, the Weight of Truth. The pregnancy test's twin pink lines blazed back at Amara from the marble countertop, as definitive as a verdict. She'd taken 4 tests, each confirming what her body had been whispering for weeks. The bone, deep exhaustion, the way certain scents turned her stomach, the subtle changes. Only a medical professional would recognize this early. 9 months into their marriage, she'd conceived with just 3 months remaining before Nathan's ultimatum expired. Amara sank onto the edge of her bathtub, her hands unconsciously moving to her still flat stomach. 2 weeks ago, this moment would have felt like salvation. 2 weeks ago, before the night of Nathan's allergic reaction, before she'd seen the broken boy hiding behind the corporate executive, this positive test would have been nothing more than a reprieve from divorce. Now, everything felt impossibly complicated. Since that night in the hospital, where Nathan had spent 6 hours under observation while Amara sat beside his bed, their hands linked like a lifeline. Something had shifted between them. Not love, certainly not that, but something that felt like the foundation upon which love might eventually be built. They talked now, really talked about his work and hers, about books and current events, and everything except the growing awareness that they were both attracted to each other in ways that had nothing to do with arranged marriages and ultimatums. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd gotten pregnant during their first encounter that had felt like making love rather than fulfilling an obligation. 3 nights after the hospital, when Nathan had found her working late in her sunroom and brought her tea without being asked, when conversation had flowed naturally into comfortable silence, and silence had somehow become tentative touches and whispered words in the darkness of her bedroom. Amara had suspected for 2 weeks but denied it to herself, attributing her symptoms to stress and the emotional toll of their complicated marriage. The exhaustion could be from working 18-hour days on her research. The food aversions could be anxiety. The missed period could be her body responding to emotional trauma. But the tests didn't lie. 4 weeks since that night, when conversation had turned to tentative touches in her sunroom, when Nathan had helped her reorganize her research papers, and their hands had lingered. 4 weeks since their first encounter that felt like connection rather than obligation, born from his gratitude for saving his life and her surprise at his genuine interest in her work. The irony was almost cosmic. She'd conceived during the first moment their marriage felt real. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Amara. Nathan's voice carried concern. Are you feeling all right? Mrs. Brooks said you didn't eat breakfast. Amara quickly tucked the ultrasound image deeper into her purse and opened the door. Nathan stood in the hallway, dressed for work, but his expression showed genuine worry, something that had become more common since their growing closeness. Just tired from staying up late with research, she said, which wasn't entirely false. Nathan studied her with those perceptive gray eyes. You've seemed different lately. Maybe you should see a doctor. If only he knew. I'm fine. Just the usual stress of she gestured vaguely between them. Of us? Nathan finished, stepping closer. Amara, I know things have been complicated since we learned about our father's history, but we've been growing closer, and I don't want that to stop because of something that happened 20 years ago. Amara felt that familiar crack in her defenses. Over the past month, since the night he'd helped her reorganize her research and they'd talked until dawn, something had shifted between them. The discovery of their father's connection, Nathan's family's lawsuit against Dr. Thompson after Liam's death, had initially driven them apart. But slowly, they'd begun to understand that they could choose to be different from their parents' mistakes. Amara took the folder with trembling fingers, though she couldn't say why her hands were shaking. Inside were photocopied medical records, newspaper clippings, and what looked like hospital documents dating back 20 years. Liam's medical files, Nathan explained quietly. I finally requested them from Mount Sinai. You were right, Amara. Your father was one of his doctors. Amara's eyes scanned the documents, recognizing her father's handwriting on several progress notes, his signature on treatment plans and medication orders. But it was the newspaper clipping that made her blood run cold. Medical malpractice suit. Filed in child's death. The headline read, dated 6 months after Liam Carter's death. The article detailed allegations that Dr. Samuel Thompson had administered an incorrect medication dosage, leading to complications that resulted in the boy's death. The suit had been filed by Nathaniel Carter Sr. and Eleanor Carter against Dr. Foe, Thompson in Mount Sinai Hospital. Amara's hands shook as she read further. The case had been dismissed when it was proven that Dr. Thompson had followed all protocols correctly, that Liam's death was due to the aggressive nature of his leukemia rather than medical error. But the damage to her father's reputation had been devastating. "I remember," Amara whispered, the memories flooding back with painful clarity. She'd been 6 years old when her father had come home from work crying, when the medical board had investigated him, when he'd lost his position at the hospital and struggled to find work anywhere else. "This is why he opened the clinic. He couldn't get hired anywhere else after your family sued him." Nathan's face was pale. "Amara, I had no idea. My parents never told me there had been a lawsuit. They just said the doctors had failed, Liam." Amara looked up from the documents, seeing the horror in Nathan's expression as he realized the implications. "Your family destroyed my father's career over something that wasn't his fault. My parents were grieving. My father was grieving too." Amara's voice broke. "He loved Liam. I remember him talking about this brilliant little boy who wanted to be a doctor when he grew up, who asked a million questions about every procedure. When Liam died, it broke something in my father, too." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of 20 years of consequences neither of them had understood until now. "The clinic," Nathan said slowly, "when my family offered to fund it. Guilt money," Amara finished bitterly. "Your parents must have figured out the truth eventually, that they'd ruined an innocent man's career. So, they threw money at the problem and tried to arrange a marriage that would somehow balance the scales." Nathan set down the folder and reached for Amara's hands, but she pulled away. "Don't," she said, backing toward the window. "Just don't. I need to think." But Nathan followed her, his voice urgent. "Amara, this doesn't change anything between us. What my parents did, what happened 20 years ago, it's not our fault. Isn't it?" Amara whirled to face him. "Our entire relationship is built on a lie, Nathan. Your family destroyed mine, then offered to save it in exchange for me. I'm not your wife. I'm reparations." "That's not true." Nathan's voice was firm, but Amara could see the doubt in his eyes. "Whatever brought us together, what's happening between us now, that's real." Amara wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to believe that the tentative connection growing between them was genuine, that the way he looked at her sometimes, like she was something precious rather than something useful, meant something beyond their circumstances. But now she knew the truth. She wasn't Nathan's chosen partner. She was his family's way of solving their conscience over destroying her father's life. And the children she carried weren't the product of love or even mutual desire. They were the culmination of a 20-year plan to balance cosmic scales. "I need some air," she said, moving toward the door. "Amara, please." "I said I need air." The words came out sharper than she intended, and Nathan flinched as if she'd slapped him. Amara escaped to the gardens, finding her way to the rose arbor, where she'd often retreated when the weight of their arrangement felt too heavy. The morning sun was warm on her face, but she felt cold inside, hollowed out by revelations that recontextualized everything she thought she knew about her life. She thought about her father, who'd spent 20 years working in an understaffed clinic in East Harlem because his dreams of pediatric oncology had been crushed by grief and false accusations. She thought about the children who'd benefited from his care despite his reduced circumstances, about the lives he'd saved even after his own life had been derailed. And she thought about the 2 tiny lives growing inside her, innocent of their parents' complicated history, but destined to be part of it. Amara's hand moved to her stomach again, and for the first time since seeing those pink lines, she felt a flicker of something that might have been maternal instinct. Whatever circumstances had created them, whatever guilt or arrangement or cosmic justice had brought their parents together, these babies deserve better than to be born into a marriage built on secrets and 20-year-old wounds. They deserved love real lovenot, the careful affection she and Nathan had been building around their mutual attraction and shared loneliness. But as Amara sat in the rose garden, feeling the first stirrings of life inside her and carrying the weight of truth that seemed too heavy for her shoulders, she wondered if love was possible when it was rooted in so much pain. If 2 people could build something real from the rubble of their family's mistakes, if she could raise these children to be better than the circumstances that created them, only time would tell. But first, she had to decide when and if to tell Nathan that he was going to be a father, that his ultimatum had been met, but in doing so, had bound them together in ways neither of them had anticipated. The secret felt like a stone in her chest, but for now, it was hers to carry alone. Chapter 5. The Revelation. Twin Miracles. Amara had carried the secret for 4 weeks when her body forced the revelation. She sat in her sunroom laboratory, analyzing the latest trial data, when the cramping began. Initially, she dismissed it as normal early pregnancy discomfort. She was 12 weeks along, though she'd hidden every symptom from Nathan. But when the cramping sharpened and she felt warmth spreading between her legs, terror struck like lightning. "No, no, no," she whispered, looking down at the spotting that could mean everything or nothing. In her medical training, she'd counseled dozens of women through pregnancy complications, had delivered bad news with professional compassion. But being the patient rather than the doctor was an entirely different kind of terror. She was reaching for her phone to call her obstetrician when Nathan appeared in the doorway, earlier than usual from his Manhattan office. "Amara, I brought dinner from that Italian place you." He stopped mid-sentence, taking in her pale face, and the way she was gripping the edge of her desk. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," she said automatically, but her voice was shaky, and her attempt to stand resulted in another sharp cramp that made her gasp. Nathan was across the room in 3 quick strides, his hand steadying her as she swayed. "You're bleeding," he said. And Amara realized that her light-colored dress had a telltale stain. "It's nothing serious," she tried again. But even as she said it, another cramp hit her so hard that she doubled over. "We're going to the hospital," Nathan said, his voice brooking no argument. "No, I just need to call my doctor." "Amara, you're bleeding and in pain." "We're going now." Nathan's arm was already around her waist, supporting her weight as he guided her toward the door. "Mrs. Brooks," he called out, his voice carrying through the house with an urgency that brought the housekeeper running. "Call Dr. Lopez at Mount Sinai and tell her we're bringing Amara in," Nathan instructed rapidly. "Tell her it's an emergency." "Nathan, you don't understand." Amara tried to protest, but another wave of cramping cut off her words. "Then explain it to me in the car," Nathan said, sweeping her up in his arms when she stumbled again. "Right now, I just need to get you somewhere safe." The drive to Mount Sinai was a blur of pain and panic. Amara found herself gripping Nathan's hand as he drove with his other hand, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, as he navigated Manhattan traffic with single-minded determination. "Talk to me," he said, his voice tight with worry. "What's happening? What aren't you telling me?" Amara closed her eyes, feeling tears leak down her cheeks. There was no hiding it now, no careful planning for the right moment or the right words. Her secret was being forced out of her by blood and pain, and the very real possibility that she might lose the babies she'd only just begun to love. "I'm pregnant," she whispered. Nathan's hand went slack in hers for a moment before tightening again. She felt the car slow slightly as he processed her words. "Pregnant," he repeated, and Amara couldn't read his tone. "How long?" 12 weeks, Amara whispered. Nathan's voice was quiet, calculating. "So you conceived 9 weeks ago. That night when you helped me reorganize my research, when we talked until 3 o'clock in the morning, and—" She trailed off, remembering how natural it had felt, how different from their previous stilted encounters, when it felt real for the first time. "Yes," Nathan finished softly. Nathan was quiet for a long moment, maneuvering through traffic with careful precision. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she expected. "Are you okay? The bleeding? Is that normal?" "Sometimes," Amara said. Though her medical training was screaming warnings, she didn't want to voice, "But the cramping is getting worse." Nathan's jaw tightened, and he pressed harder on the accelerator. At the hospital, everything moved with the efficient urgency that Amara knew well from her own medical training. Dr. Lopez, her obstetrician, was waiting with a wheelchair and a team of nurses who whisked Amara away for examination, while Nathan was left to pace in the waiting room. "Let's see what we're dealing with, doctor," Lopez said kindly, helping Amara onto the examination table. "When did the bleeding start?" Amara answered the questions mechanically, her mind divided between medical analysis and sheer terror. "When Dr. Lopez began the ultrasound. Amara held her breath, afraid of what they might or might not find. "There, doctor," Lopez said, pointing to the screen with a smile that made Amara's heart restart. 2 strong heartbeats. "Your twins are fine, Amara." "Twins," Amara breathed, even though she'd known since her first ultrasound 3 weeks ago. Hearing it confirmed again, seeing the 2 tiny forms moving on the screen, made it real in a way that previous appointments hadn't. "Very healthy twins, doctor?" Lopez confirmed. "The bleeding appears to be implantation bleeding, which can be more pronounced with multiples. Nothing to worry about, but I want you on bed rest for the next week, just to be safe." Relief flooded through Amara so completely that she started crying in earnest. "They're really okay? They're perfect. Do you want to bring Daddy in to see?" Amara nodded, and within moments, Nathan was in the room, his face a mask of barely controlled emotion. "Dr." Lopez repeated her findings, showing Nathan the ultrasound images while Amara watched his face transform. "Twins," he said softly, reaching out to touch the screen with a reverence that made Amara's chest tight. "Are they? Do you know if they're—" "Too early to tell sex, Doctor," Lopez said with a smile. "But they're both developing beautifully. You should be very proud. Mom's been taking excellent care of them." Nathan's eyes found Amara's, and she saw something in them that took her breath away. Not the cold satisfaction of a contract fulfilled, not the relief of an heir secured, but wonder pure, unguarded wonder mixed with a protectiveness so fierce it was almost frightening. "Twins," he repeated, and when he reached for Amara's hand, his was shaking. The drive home was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence than they'd shared in months past. Nathan drove carefully, as if Amara was made of spun glass, stealing glances at her every few seconds. "You should have told me," he said finally as they pulled into their driveway. "I know," Amara admitted. "I wanted to, but I gave you a deadline instead of a partnership," Nathan finished, his voice heavy with regret. "I turned something that should have been joyful into something that felt like a business transaction." Amara looked at him, surprised by the self-awareness in his tone. "Nathan, no, let me say this." He turned to face her fully, his gray eyes intense. "What I said to you on our wedding night, the ultimatum I gave you, it was wrong. Completely wrong. I was so focused on fulfilling promises I made to a dying child that I forgot the woman in front of me was real, with feelings and dreams and worth that had nothing to do with what she could give me." Amara felt tears threatening again. "You were grieving. Your family was pressuring you. That's not an excuse," Nathan said firmly. "I hurt you. I reduced you to nothing more than a means to an end. And I've been watching you carry that pain for months. The fact that you're pregnant, that you're giving Mayus children, that should be celebrated. Not treated like a business contract fulfilled." He reached for her hands, and this time Amara didn't pull away. "I know I can't take back what I said that night. I know our marriage started in the worst possible way. But Amara, these children, our children, they don't have to be born into the same dysfunction that created us. We can be better than that." Amara studied his face, seeing sincerity there, but also fear. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want to try. Really try. Not because of ultimatums or family expectations or 20-year-old guilt, but because somewhere in this mess, I think we could build something real." Nathan's voice was soft, vulnerable in a way she'd rarely heard. "I'm saying I want to be the kind of father these babies deserve, and the kind of husband you should have had from the beginning." Amara felt something shift in her chest, that crack in her heart widening to let in a possibility she'd been afraid to hope for. "I'd like that," she whispered. Nathan's smile was radiant, transforming his entire face. "Good. Because I think we're going to be amazing parents." As he helped her out of the car and into the house, his arm protectively around her waist, Amara allowed herself to imagine what their life might look like if they truly started over, if they built their marriage on choice rather than arrangement, on love rather than obligation. It wouldn't be easy. They had months of hurt to overcome, years of family dysfunction to break free from. But as Nathan settled her carefully onto the living room sofa and went to make her tea without being asked, Amara thought that maybe, just maybe, they could create something beautiful from the ashes of what had been forced upon them. The twins kicked gently against her ribs, as if agreeing with her assessment. And for the first time since seeing those pink lines on the pregnancy test, Amara smiled with genuine joy at the thought of bringing these children into the world, their children, born not of ultimatum, but of love slowly finding its way. Chapter 6. The Great Departure Without a Goodbye. 21 hours of labor had left Amara feeling dismantled and rebuilt by amateur hands. But when Dr. Lopez placed the first baby in her arms, a perfect, indignant little boy with his father's thundercloud eyes and her own determined chin, every moment of agony evaporated into irrelevance. "Samuel," she whispered, naming him after her father. The baby's tiny fist wrapped around her finger with a grip that seemed to anchor her to the earth in an entirely new way. 2 minutes later, his brother arrived with significantly less drama, sliding into the world with what the nurses laughingly called typical second-child confidence. This one had Amara's darker complexion and what looked like it would be Nathan's strong jaw. "Liam," she said softly, choosing the name that honored the boy whose death had shaped so much of their story, but who would now live on in a different way. Nathan had been relegated to the waiting room during the actual delivery. A last-minute complication with Amara's blood pressure had made the medical team cautious about visitors. For the last hour, she'd been able to hear him pacing outside the door, his footsteps a rhythm of anxiety that made her heart ache, even through her exhaustion. "Should we bring Daddy in to meet his sons?" Dr. Lopez asked, beaming at the 2 babies now nestled against Amara's chest. Amara looked down at Samuel and Liam, these perfect little beings who had grown inside her body, who were part of her in ways that went beyond biology. In the quiet recovery room, with late afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows, something crystallized in her mind with painful clarity. These children deserved better than a marriage built on ultimatums and family guilt. They deserved better than parents who were still learning how to love each other. They deserved a mother who could protect them from the same kind of conditional love that had shaped their father. "Not yet," Amara said quietly. I need a few minutes with them first." Dr. Lopez nodded understandingly. "Of course. I'll go update your husband on how well you did. 2 healthy baby boys, 6 pounds 3 ounces for Samuel, and 6 pounds even for Liam. You should be very proud." When the doctor left, Amara was alone with her sons for the first time. She studied their faces, memorizing every detail. The way Samuel's left ear was slightly smaller than his right, the tiny birthmark on Liam's shoulder that looked like a crescent moon. They smelled like innocence and new beginnings, like every possibility in the world wrapped in soft blue blankets. "I love you," she whispered to them, "more than I ever thought it was possible to love anyone." And that's why the words stuck in her throat, but her resolve didn't waver. Through the thin walls of the hospital room, she could still hear Nathan's voice as he spoke with Dr. Lopez, the excitement and wonder evident even in his muffled tones. He was describing plans for the nursery, asking questions about feeding schedules and pediatrician recommendations, sounding every inch the devoted father he probably genuinely wanted to be. But Amara remembered another night, another conversation, words that had cut her soul. "If you don't give me a baby within 1 year, I'll divorce you without a second thought." She remembered the coldness in his voice, the way he'd looked at her like she was a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be loved. And she thought about their children growing up in a house where love was conditional, where their worth was tied to their usefulness in maintaining a family legacy. No, she wouldn't let that happen. Moving carefully, still sore from delivery, Amara reached for her phone. Her fingers shook as she composed a text to her cousin Layla, who'd been her closest friend since childhood. "Need you to come to Mount Sinai now. Emergency. Don't tell anyone." The response came within seconds. "On my way." Amara then called her father, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Daddy, I need you to make arrangements for the babies and me to stay at the clinic for a while. I can't explain right now, but I need to leave here tonight." Dr. Thompson's voice was concerned but trusting. "Of course, baby girl. Whatever you need." The next hour passed in a carefully orchestrated dance of deception. When the nurses came to check on her, Amara smiled and asked normal questions about breastfeeding and discharge procedures. When Nathan knocked on the door, she called out that she was resting and needed a little more time. "I understand." Nathan's voice carried through the door, warm with love and patience. "Take all the time you need. I'll be right here when you're ready." Those words, spoken with such genuine care, almost broke her resolve. But then Samuel stirred in her arms, and Amara remembered that this wasn't about her anymore. This was about protecting these innocent children from the kind of marriage that had produced their father. Duty-bound, emotionally sterile, built on contracts rather than love. Layla arrived as the sun was setting, her face creased with worry. "Amara, what's going on? You look—" "I need you to help me get the babies out of here," Amara interrupted, her voice low and urgent. "There's a service elevator at the end of the hall that goes directly to the parking garage. Can you bring your car around?" "Amara Elise Thompson, what the hell? Please." Amara's voice broke on the word. "I'll explain everything later, but right now, I need you to trust me. These babies, they deserve better than what I can give them here." Layla searched her cousin's face, seeing a desperation there that made her stop asking questions. "Okay, give me 10 minutes. The escape was easier than Amara had imagined. The evening shift was lighter staffed, and the nurses assumed Nathan had already taken the babies to see them when she told them the boys were with their father. She dressed quickly in the clothes Layla had brought, her body protesting every movement, and carefully placed Samuel and Liam in the infant car seats her cousin had somehow procured. The escape was methodical, planned with the precision of a medical procedure. Layla arrived with Amara's discharge clothes and 2 properly installed infant car seats. The evening shift was lighter, and Amara's medical credentials allowed her to navigate hospital protocols with authority. When the nurse asked about the father, Amara showed her wedding ring and explained Nathan was handling discharge paperwork at the billing office, a believable delay that would give them a 30-minute window. As they waited for the service elevator, Amara heard Nathan's voice from the main desk, asking about visiting hours and discussing the baby's feeding schedule with obvious excitement. He sounded like a man falling in love with children he'd never met. But love and readiness weren't the same thing. The elevator arrived, and Amara made her choice. On the dashboard of Layla's car, Amara left an envelope addressed to Nathan. Inside was a simple note written on hospital stationery. "Nathan, you wanted heirs. I gave you sons. The contract is fulfilled. Samuel Thompson Carter, born 6, 47, M. 6, Lobras, 3 Os. Liam Thompson Carter, born 6, 49 P. M. 6, LB, Evan. They are healthy and perfect. Dr. Lopez has all their medical information. Please don't try to find us. Let them grow up, knowing love instead of obligation." By the time Nathan returned to Amara's room 30 minutes later, carrying coffee and the stuffed elephants he'd bought in the gift shop, he found only empty beds and silence. The nurses, confused and increasingly frantic, searched the entire maternity ward. Security reviewed footage of the elevator and parking garage, but Amara Elise Carter and her infant sons had simply vanished into the New York night, leaving behind only a man who realized too late that he'd lost everything that mattered, while he was waiting outside a door that would never open for him again. Nathan stood in the empty room, holding the note that explained nothing and changed everything. And for the second time in his life, he understood what it meant to lose family to his own failures. The difference was that this time, he knew exactly who to blame. Chapter 7. The first plea at her father's clinic, desperation begins. 3 weeks of private investigators yielding nothing. 3 weeks of sleepless nights staring at ultrasound photos, wondering if his sons were healthy, sleeping peacefully, or crying for a father who'd never held them. 3 weeks in a mansion that echoed with the ghosts of lullabies never sung and bedtime stories never told. Nathan had finally located them through Amara's medical license renewal. She'd listed the clinic as her primary practice address. It wasn't detective work. It was inevitability. Amara was brilliant, but she wasn't hiding. She was living her life, raising their sons, and apparently trusting that his shame would keep him away. She'd underestimated his desperation. Now he stood across from the Thompson Family Medical Clinic, a modest brick building that served as both medical practice and apparently home to his estranged family. Through the windows, he could see the waiting room filled with patients' evidence that Amara hadn't just retreated, but had thrown herself into work that mattered. Through the large front windows, he could see patients in the waiting room, mostly women with young children, elderly men reading Spanish, language newspapers, teenagers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. This was where Amara had grown up, in the shadow of her father's dedication to serving people who couldn't afford Park Avenue medical care. This was the world she'd agreed to leave behind when she married him, and the world she'd return to when his ultimatum finally drove her away. Nathan had been standing there for 20 minutes when he saw her. Amara emerged from one of the exam rooms, wearing scrubs instead of the designer clothes he'd grown accustomed to seeing her in. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she looked tired in a way that made Nathan's chest ache. But she was beautiful, God. She was so beautiful that it took his breath away, even from across a busy street. She was carrying a baby. Nathan's heart stopped. The infant in her arms was tiny, perfect, wearing a blue onesie that said, "I love Daddy," in cheerful yellow letters. The irony of the message hit Nathan like a physical blow. This had to be Samuel or Liam, his son, his child, a little person he'd helped create but had never held. Without conscious thought, Nathan found himself crossing the street, dodging traffic, and ignoring the honking horns. He pushed through the clinic's front door with enough force to make the bell jangle violently, causing every head in the waiting room to turn toward him. The sight that greeted him was like something from a movie. Amara stood frozen near the reception desk, the baby in her arms, her face cycling through shock, fear, and something that looked like panic. Dr. Thompson emerged from another exam room, took one look at Nathan, and immediately positioned himself between his daughter and the man who'd driven her to flee in the middle of the night. "Mr. Carter, Doctor," Thompson said evenly, his voice carrying the careful professionalism of a man used to handling difficult situations. "This is unexpected." Nathan couldn't take his eyes off the baby, his son. Up close, the resemblance was unmistakable. That was definitely Nathan's nose, and the way the baby's tiny fist was clenched reminded him of pictures of himself as an infant. "I need to talk to Amara," Nathan said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "Please." "I don't think that's a good idea, Doctor," Thompson replied, but his words were drowned out by a soft crying from somewhere in the back of the clinic. "The other twin," Nathan whispered, understanding flooding through him. "They're both here." Amara's arms tightened protectively around the baby. "Samuel." Nathan somehow knew it was Samuel from the way he was studying the world with serious eyes. "You need to leave," she said quietly. But her voice carried clearly through the suddenly silent waiting room. "Amara, please, just 5 minutes. I just want to—" Nathan took a step forward, and Dr. Thompson immediately moved to block him. "My daughter asked you to leave," the older man said firmly. But Nathan was beyond rational thought. 3 weeks of grief and regret and desperate love for children he'd never held had finally broken something inside him. In front of a dozen strangers, in front of patients who had come seeking medical care and instead found themselves witness to a domestic drama, Nathaniel Carter-Tech mogul, heir to generations of old money, a man who had been taught from birth that emotion was weakness, fell apart. "Please," he said, and the word came out as a sob. "Please, I'm begging you. I know I don't deserve it. I know I was terrible to you, but they're my sons. I've never even held them, Amara. I've never heard them cry or seen them smile or watched them sleep." The waiting room had gone completely silent, except for the soft murmur of the television and the distant sound of the second baby crying. Nathan was dimly aware that people were staring, that he was making a scene, but he was past caring about dignity or pride or any of the things that had once seemed important. "I was wrong," he continued, his voice breaking completely. "That night, our wedding night, what I said to you, it was the worst thing I've ever done. I was scared and stupid, and I hurt you in ways I can't take back. But Amara, I love you. I love our children. I've been in hell for 3 weeks wondering if they're okay, if they need anything, if they—" "Stop." Amara's voice cut through his desperate rambling. Nathan looked at her, seeing tears in her eyes that she was fighting not to shed. Samuel had gone quiet in her arms, as if sensing the tension around him. "You made your choice that first night," Amara continued, her voice steady despite the tears. "You told me exactly what you thought of me, what I was worth to you. A year to produce an heir, or you'd throw me away like garbage. Well, I gave you sons, Nathan. Beautiful, perfect sons. The contract is fulfilled." "It was never about a contract," Nathan said desperately. "I was scared." "It was about control," Amara interrupted. It was about reducing me to nothing more than a womb with legs, and I won't let my children grow up thinking that's what love looks like. Dr. Thompson placed a gentle hand on his daughter's shoulder. Amara, perhaps we should take this conversation somewhere more private. But Amara was shaking her head. No, Daddy. He needs to hear this here, in front of everyone, because this is real life. This is what happens when powerful men think they can buy and threaten their way to happiness. She adjusted Samuel in her arms and looked directly at Nathan. You want to see your son? Here he is. This is Samuel Thompson Carter. He's 3 weeks old. He weighs 7 pounds 4 ounces, and he's starting to smile when he hears music. His brother Liam is in the nursery. He's got colic, which means he cries for 3 hours every evening, and the only thing that calms him down is when I read medical journals out loud. Nathan drank in every detail hungrily, memorizing his son's face, the way his tiny fingers moved, the serious expression that made him look like a very small, very wise old man. They're perfect, he whispered. Yes, they are, Amara agreed. And they deserve better than a father who sees them as obligations to fulfill rather than people to love. I don't see them that way. Amara, please, if you could just give me a chance to show you. No. Amara's voice was final. You had your chance, Nathan. You had 10 months to show me what kind of man you were, what kind of husband and father you could be. Instead, you showed me that your love comes with conditions and deadlines. She turned toward the back of the clinic, then paused. I'll send you pictures, she said without looking back. And medical information. You have a right to know they're healthy and growing, but that's all you have a right to. Amara, wait. But she was already disappearing through the door marked private, taking Samuel with her. Dr. Thompson remained behind, his expression a mixture of professional courtesy and paternal protectiveness. Mr. Carter, he said quietly, I think it would be best if you left now. Nathan stood in the middle of the clinic waiting room, surrounded by strangers who had witnessed his complete breakdown, feeling more alone than he'd ever felt in his life. Through the thin walls, he could hear both babies crying now, and the sound cut through him like knives. Please, he said to Dr. Thompson, his voice barely above a whisper, please tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I'll do anything. I'll tell her, Dr. Thompson said gently. But son, I think you need to understand that some things can't be fixed with apologies and good intentions. Sometimes, the only thing you can do is prove you've changed, and that takes time. As Nathan stumbled out of the clinic and back onto the street, Dr. Thompson's words echoed in his mind. Time. The one thing he'd given Amara so little of during their marriage, and the one thing he now had too much of. Empty days stretching ahead without his wife, without his children, without the family he'd destroyed through his own arrogance. But if time was what it took, then time was what he'd give. However long it took to prove he was worthy of a second chance, Nathan would wait. He would work to become the man Amara and their sons deserved, even if it took the rest of his life, even if in the end it wasn't enough. Chapter 8. The Second Plea. The Charity Gala. Public Humiliation for Love. Nathan stood at the back of the Temple of Dindur, fists clenched in his pockets as he watched Amara prepare to receive the Young Researcher Excellence Award. He'd discovered the gala through society pages, seen her name among the honorees for her groundbreaking work in gene therapy. 2 months since, the clinic confrontation. 2 months since he'd seen his sons. 2 months of living in emotional exile, sending weekly flowers to the clinic, never to Amara, directly with notes saying simply, thinking of you and the boys. She never acknowledged them, but they stopped being returned. He counted that as progress. Tonight, she looked luminous. Amara wore a deep emerald gown that complemented her skin perfectly, her natural hair styled in an elegant updo that showcased the delicate line of her neck. She moved through the crowd with grace and confidence, accepting congratulations and discussing her research with animated gestures that reminded Nathan of why he'd fallen for her intelligence before he'd ever noticed her beauty. She hadn't seen him yet. Nathan had been careful to stay out of her line of sight, knowing that his presence would likely send her fleeing. But when Dr. Sophia Lynn, the evening's host, took the podium to introduce Amara's award presentation, Nathan knew his time was running out. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Lynn announced, her voice carrying clearly through the museum's acoustics, It is my honor to present this year's Young Researcher Excellence Award to Dr. Amara Thompson, whose innovative work in gene therapy for sickle cell disease has the potential to save countless lives. The audience applauded politely as Amara made her way to the stage, her smile radiant but professional. Nathan watched her accept the Crystal Award, listened as she began her acceptance speech about the importance of medical research funding and accessible health care. "When I was a child," Amara said into the microphone, her voice clear and strong, "I watched my father treat patients who couldn't afford to see specialists, who came to our clinic because it was the only place that would see them, regardless of their ability to pay. That experience taught me that medical breakthroughs mean nothing if they can't reach the people who need them most." Nathan felt a surge of pride that was immediately followed by devastating loss. This brilliant, compassionate woman had been his wife. She was the mother of his children, and he'd driven her away with his own cruelty and short-sightedness. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice carrying through the museum's acoustics. "Dr. Thompson, if I could have a moment." The room went quiet. 500 people turned to stare as Nathan Carter approached the stage with obvious determination. Dr. Lynn, recognizing the husband whose separation from Amara had been whispered about in social circles, hesitated visibly. Amara froze at the podium, her face cycling through shock and something that looked like betrayal. "Nathan, what are you doing here?" "Something I should have done months ago," Nathan said, reaching the stage steps. "Dr. Lynn, I apologize for the disruption, but I need to say something publicly that I should have said privately long ago." Dr. Lynn looked between them, sensing undercurrents beyond her understanding, but recognizing the gravity of the moment. "Suppose we can allow a brief statement." Amara grabbed Nathan's arm as he moved toward the podium. "Don't," she whispered urgently. "Whatever you're thinking of doing, don't. Not here, not in front of all these people." But Nathan gently removed her hand from his arm, his eyes never leaving her face. "I'm sorry, Amara, but I've tried private, and private isn't working. Maybe public will get through to you." He stepped up to the microphone, looking out at hundreds of faces that ranged from curious to scandalized to openly fascinated by the drama unfolding before them. In the front row, he spotted his own parents, his mother's face a mask of horror at whatever social disaster her son was about to create. "Good evening," Nathan said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. "I'm Nathan Carter, and I need to tell you all a story about the worst mistake of my life." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Behind him, Amara made a soft sound of distress. But Nathan continued. 2 years ago, I married the most incredible woman I'd ever met. Dr. Amara Thompson, now Amara Thompson Carter, is brilliant, compassionate, and devoted to saving lives. She agreed to marry me to help save her father's medical clinic, which serves some of the most underserved communities in New York City. Nathan paused, looking directly at Amara, who stood frozen beside the podium with tears beginning to form in her eyes. "On our wedding night, instead of telling my new wife that I loved her, instead of promising to cherish and protect her, I gave her an ultimatum. I told her she had 1 year to give me a child, or I would divorce her without a second thought." The gasp that went through the crowd was audible. Nathan saw his mother bury her face in her hands, saw distinguished faces throughout the audience, register shock and disgust at his public confession. "I reduced this remarkable woman to nothing more than a means to an end. I treated her like a business transaction instead of a human being with feelings and worth that had nothing to do with what she could give me. And when she gave me not 1 child but 2 beautiful twin boys, I still managed to lose them all through my own failures." Amara was crying openly now, but she hadn't left the stage. Nathan took that as permission to continue. 3 months ago, Amara left me. She took our sons and disappeared in the middle of the night because she couldn't trust that I would love them unconditionally, because I had shown her through my own actions that my love comes with deadlines and ultimatums. Nathan's voice broke, but he pressed on. "I'm standing here tonight, humiliating myself in front of all of you, because I need Amara to know that I've learned what love really means. It means putting someone else's happiness before your own. It means supporting their dreams instead of trying to control their choices. It means proving every day that they matter more than your own fears and insecurities." He turned to face Amara directly, no longer caring about the audience, or the whispered conversations, or the camera phones that were undoubtedly recording every moment. "Amara, I can't take back what I said to you that night. I can't undo the months of pain I caused you. But I can promise you this. If you give me another chance, I will spend every day for the rest of my life proving that you and our children are more important to me than any legacy or family expectation or business arrangement." The silence in the museum was deafening. Nathan could hear his own heartbeat, could see the tears streaming down Amara's face, could feel the weight of hundreds of stares. "I love you," he said simply. "I love our sons, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes, for as long as it takes, to earn the right to be part of your lives again." For a moment, Nathan thought he'd reached her. Something in Amara's expression softened, and she took a half step toward him. But then she seemed to remember where they were, seemed to realize that hundreds of people were watching her most private pain play out on a public stage. Her face hardened, and when she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the microphone system. "Words are easy, Nathan," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "You showed me your heart that first night. Everything else is just performance." With that, she walked off the stage, leaving Nathan alone under the lights with the weight of his public confession and the knowledge that even his most desperate gesture hadn't been enough. "I deserve that," he said into the microphone, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent museum. "I deserved all of it, but I won't give up because they're worth fighting for. Even if I'm not worth fighting for." He left the stage to absolute silence, walking through the crowd that parted before him like he was contagious. At the museum's entrance, he paused to look back one more time. But Amara was nowhere to be seen. His public humiliation was complete, but his private mission was far from over. If anything, standing on that stage and laying his soul bare in front of New York's social elite had only strengthened his resolve. He would find another way to reach her. He would prove that his love was more than words, more than grand gestures, more than desperate public declarations, even if it took the rest of his life. Chapter 9. The Third and Fourth Pleas, Rock Bottom and Revelation. 8 months after the gala, the baptism at St. Macian, Augustine's Catholic Church in East Harlem stood in stark contrast to the cathedral where Nathan and Amara had wed. Here, worn wooden pews held families who measured wealth in love rather than stock portfolios, and stained glass windows told stories of faith rather than fortune. Nathan had learned about the baptism from Dr. Thompson himself. 3 days earlier, he'd called the clinic, not trying to reach Amara, but asking to speak with her father about establishing a medical trust fund for the twins. During that conversation, Dr. Thompson had mentioned the upcoming baptism, perhaps testing whether Nathan would try to insert himself into the moment. "I won't disrupt the service," Nathan had promised. "But I'd like to be there, even from a distance. They're my sons." Dr. Thompson had been quiet for a long moment. "The back pew. You don't approach unless Amara indicates it's acceptable." So here he sat, honored by permission he'd never expected, watching his children receive blessings from a community that had embraced them while their father remained a stranger. Samuel and Liam were 8 months old now, and from his distant vantage point, Nathan could see they were thriving. Samuel sat quietly in Amara's arms, studying the world with the same serious expression Nathan remembered from that day at the clinic. Liam was more active, reaching for everything within his grasp and babbling what sounded like commentary on the proceedings. They were beautiful. They were perfect, and they were complete strangers to him. Nathan watched as Dr. Thompson held his grandson while the priest performed the blessing, watched as Amara's extended family gathered around the baptismal font with smiles and tears of joy. This should have been a moment they shared as parents, a day they planned together, a memory they created as a family. Instead, Nathan was a spectator to his own children's lives. When the ceremony concluded and the congregation began filing out, Nathan stood to leave. But 8-month-old Liam chose that moment to look directly at him from across the church. And their eyes met for the first time since the hospital. The baby's face broke into a wide, toothless grin, and he reached out his tiny arms toward Nathan as if recognizing something familiar. The gesture was so innocent, so purely joyful, that Nathan felt his composure shatter completely. "Oh God," he whispered, and the sound carried farther than he'd intended in the now quiet church. Amara turned, following her son's gaze, and her face went pale when she saw Nathan standing frozen in the back pew, tears streaming down his face. "What are you doing here?" she called out, her voice echoing off the wooden beams. Nathan couldn't speak. He couldn't do anything but stare at Liam, who was still smiling at him with the uncomplicated joy that only babies possess. This was his son, his child, and he was looking at his father with love that Nathan had done nothing to earn and everything to forfeit. "I'm sorry," Nathan managed finally, his voice breaking. I needed to see them. I needed to know they were okay." Amara walked toward him, still carrying Samuel, while Dr. Thompson followed with Liam. The extended family hung back, sensing the weight of the moment, but not wanting to intrude. "You can't keep doing this," Amara said quietly when she reached him. "You can't keep showing up at important moments uninvited. It's not fair to any of us." "I know," Nathan said, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I know it's not fair. But Amara," he smiled at me. Liam smiled at me. "And I've never even held him." The pain in his voice was so raw, so completely unguarded, that even Amara seemed shaken by it. "Nathan, please," she said, and the word came out as a plea. "Please, just once. Just let me hold them once. I'm begging you, Amara. I know I don't deserve it. I know I've done everything wrong, but they're my sons, and I've never—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The grief was too overwhelming, the loss too complete. Dr. Thompson, who had been watching the exchange with the careful eye of a man who'd seen too much human suffering to be surprised by any of it, stepped forward. "Amara," he said softly, "perhaps." But Amara was already shaking her head. "No, Daddy. I can't. Not yet." She looked at Nathan with eyes that held both compassion and unshakable resolve. "You broke something in me that first night, Nathan. Something I'm still trying to heal. I can't let you near them until I really know that you won't break something in them too." Nathan nodded, understanding even as his heart shattered a little more. "I'm going to keep trying," he said quietly. "I'm going to keep trying to prove to you that I've changed." "I know," Amara said. "But words aren't enough anymore. Even actions might not be enough. You need to understand that some damage can't be undone. Some trust can't be rebuilt." As Nathan left the church alone, Liam's smile burned in his memory like a benediction and a condemnation all at once. 1 year later, the first birthday, the community center near the clinic had been transformed with balloons and streamers in bright primary colors. Children ran between the tables while parents chatted and kept one eye on the festivities. It was exactly the kind of birthday party Nathan had never had as a child. Warm, chaotic, filled with genuine affection rather than obligation. Amara looked radiant as she carried the birthday cake actually. 2 small cakes, one decorated with trains for Samuel and one with elephants for Liam. The boys toddled around on unsteady legs, Samuel gravitating toward books and quieter toys, while Liam seemed determined to climb everything within reach. They were walking. His sons were walking, and Nathan had missed their first steps. This time, he didn't try to hide his presence. He walked directly up to Amara, carrying an armful of carefully chosen gifts and a letter he'd spent weeks writing. "Nathan," Amara said, and her voice held resignation rather than surprise. "I wondered if you'd show up. I couldn't miss their first birthday," Nathan said simply. "I've already missed too much." He knelt down to the boys' level, his heart hammering as Samuel and Liam looked at him with curious but unafraid eyes. They didn't know him, but they didn't fear him either. Amara had been careful not to poison them against their father, even in her anger. "Happy birthday, Samuel," Nathan said softly, offering the quieter twin a puzzle box designed for toddlers. "Happy birthday, Liam," he continued, handing the more adventurous twin a set of soft blocks that could be stacked and knocked down safely. Both boys accepted the gifts with the solemnity that 1-year-olds brought to new experiences, and Nathan felt a stab of pride when Samuel immediately began trying to fit puzzle pieces together, while Liam started building a tower he could demolish. "They're incredible," Nathan said, looking up at Amara. "They're so smart, so beautiful. You've done an amazing job with them." "We've done an amazing job," Amara corrected, gesturing to include her father and extended family. "It takes a village, Nathan. Something you never understood." Nathan stood, pulling the letter from his jacket pocket. "I wrote this for you," he said. "It's not another apology. You've heard enough of those. It's it. Everything I should have said from the beginning. Everything I've learned about love and fatherhood and what it means to be worthy of a family." Amara took the letter but didn't open it. Nathan, you've been saying you've changed for a year now. You've made grand gestures and public declarations and shown up at every important event uninvited, but words and presence and dramatic moments don't erase what you did to me. Then what would? Nathan asked desperately. Tell me what I need to do, and I'll do it. Anything, Amara? I'll do anything. Amara was quiet for a long moment, watching their sons play with their new toys while the party continued around them. You need to understand, she said finally, that this isn't about earning your way back into my life. This isn't about proving you deserve a second chance. This is about learning to be a better person, whether I ever forgive you or not. She paused, and when she continued, her voice was soft but firm. You broke something in me that first night that I'm still trying to heal, Nathan. You made me feel worthless, disposable. Like my only value was what I could produce for you. Until you understand how deeply that wounded me, until you really, truly understand what it means to be threatened and diminished by someone who's supposed to love you, you're not ready to be the father these boys need. Nathan felt the truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. For a year, he'd been focused on winning her back, on proving he'd changed, on earning forgiveness. But he'd never really grappled with the depth of damage he'd done, never truly understood what it must have felt like to be reduced to nothing more than a vessel for his genetic legacy. How do I learn that? He asked quietly. Start by helping other women who've been where I was, Amara said. Start by understanding that your problem isn't that you lost your family. It's that you never learned how to love without controlling. Figure out how to be worthy of love, not how to demand it. As Nathan left the birthday party, carrying Amara's unopened letter and the weight of her words, he realized that everything he'd been doing for the past year had been about him, his pain, his loss, his desire for redemption. For the first time, he began to understand that real change would have to start with understanding her pain, her loss, her right to protection from the very thing he'd become. It was the hardest lesson he'd ever been taught, but also the most important, and for the first time since that night in the hospital, Nathan felt like he might actually be capable of learning it. Chapter 10. Hearts Unbound, the speech that changed everything. The truth about threats and love. 2 years of carefully negotiated boundaries. After the birthday party confrontation, Dr. Thompson had become an unlikely mediator, arranging monthly supervised visits where Nathan could see Samuel and Liam at the clinic. These visits came with conditions. No attempts to contact Amara directly, no gifts beyond books and educational toys, no promises to the children about future arrangements. Nathan had honored every boundary while quietly funding legal aid programs for domestic abuse survivors and attending intensive therapy to understand the psychological damage of conditional love. He'd learned that Amara had been speaking at conferences for 18 months, using their story with his explicit written permission to help other women recognize emotional abuse. He'd never attended her speeches before tonight, had specifically avoided them to respect her space. But when his therapist mentioned that healing sometimes required facing the full truth of one's impact, Nathan had made the decision to hear his story told through Amara's eyes. She didn't know he was here. This wasn't planned or orchestrated. It was two people finally occupying the same space where truth lived. For 2 years, he'd walked through fire to rebuild himself from ash, attending batterer intervention programs where men twice his size wept like children, volunteering at women's shelters where he saw the aftermath of threats like the one he'd made, funding legal clinics where lawyers fought to protect women from men exactly like he'd been. He'd done none of it for redemption. Redemption was too small a word for what he needed. He'd done it for transformation, the complete death of who he'd been, and the birth of who he needed to become. Their sons, God, their sons. Samuel and Liam were 3 now, brilliant and beautiful, carrying Amara's compassion like a genetic gift. Nathan saw them once a month in carefully supervised visits where they called him Daddy Nathan with the casual friendliness children reserved for interesting strangers. It destroyed him every time. It sustained him every time. He was watching the woman he'd lost become the warrior she'd always been meant to be. I want to tell you about the night I learned that love could be a weapon, Amara began, her voice cutting through the auditorium like a blade wrapped in silk, about the moment when the person who promised to cherish me instead taught me that my worth could be measured in biology and bounded by deadlines. The audience shifted forward as one organism, sensing the raw authenticity in her tone. I want to tell you about wedding night threats and how they don't just break hearts, they shatter souls. Nathan's hands clenched until his knuckles went white. He knew what was coming. He'd prayed for 2 years that this moment would never arrive, and simultaneously hoped it would come, so the world could finally understand what he'd done. "Picture this," Amara continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the vast space. "You're me all 2 years old. You've just married a man you thought might learn to love you. You're standing in your wedding dress, ivory silk that cost more than your father's monthly salary, and your new husband looks into your eyes and says—" Amara paused, and the silence became a living thing, pressing against every heart in the room. "If you don't give me a baby within 1 year, I'll divorce you without a second thought." The gasp that rippled through the audience was like air being sucked from the room. Nathan felt it hit his chest like a physical blow, hearing his own words echoed back through Amara's pain. In that moment, Amara's voice rose, gaining power like a gathering storm. "I stopped being a woman and became a factory. I stopped being a wife and became a contractor. I stopped being human and became a means to an end." Nathan stood up. The movement was involuntary, driven by a pain so profound it wouldn't let him remain seated while Amara dissected the very worst moment of his life. 2,000 heads turned toward him, but he saw only her, the woman whose spirit he'd tried to break, whose strength had ultimately broken him instead. Amara saw him immediately. Her speech faltered for a heartbeat as their eyes met across an ocean of faces. And Nathan watched her process his presence. Surprise. Then something that looked like fear. Then something that might have been understanding. But she didn't stop. If anything, his presence seemed to fuel her fire. "That threat, those 18 words, they didn't just hurt me," she continued, her voice now carrying the weight of prophecy. "They taught me that love could come with conditions, that my body was more valuable than my heart, that my future could be held hostage by someone else's expectations." Amara's eyes never left Nathan's as he began walking down the aisle toward the stage. "But here's what the man who made that threat didn't understand," she said, her voice rising to fill every corner of the auditorium. "You cannot love what you seek to control. You cannot cherish what you reduce to utility. You cannot build a family on the foundation of fear." Nathan reached the front of the auditorium, his face wet with tears he didn't remember shedding. "Real love," Amara declared, her voice now ringing like a bell, "doesn't issue ultimatums. Real love doesn't threaten. Real love doesn't put deadlines on devotion or conditions on care. Real love asks, 'How can I serve your happiness?' Not, 'What can you give me?'" The auditorium was so quiet Nathan could hear his own heartbeat as he climbed the steps to the stage. "May I?" he asked, his voice breaking on the 2 words. Amara studied his face, seeing something there that made her step back from the podium and nod slowly. Nathan approached the microphone with the reverence of a man approaching an altar, knowing that whatever he said next would either damn him forever or begin to heal wounds he'd inflicted with surgical precision. "My name is Nathaniel James Carter," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system, "and I am the monster who spoke those words to Dr. Amara Thompson on our wedding night." The silence that followed was thunderous. Nathan felt it pressing against him like judgment itself. 3 years ago, I looked into the eyes of the most extraordinary woman I'd ever met. And I broke her. He continued, his voice steady despite the tremors racking his body. "I took someone who entered our marriage with hope and trust and faith in love's possibility, and I reduced her to nothing more than a vessel for my family's expectations." Nathan turned to face Amara directly, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of 2 years' worth of learning what love actually meant. "I called it setting expectations. Amara has taught me to call it what it really was, emotional terrorism. I held our marriage hostage. I made her worth conditional. I turned what should have been our sanctuary into her prison." A sob escaped someone in the audience, then another, until the sound of weeping became a symphony of recognition from women who'd heard similar words in their own lives. "I don't deserve to be standing on this stage," Nathan continued. "I don't deserve to breathe the same air as the woman whose spirit I tried to break. But I'm here because 2 years ago, Amara told me something that saved my life, not by offering me hope, but by taking it away." He paused, finding strength in Amara's unwavering gaze. She told me that earning forgiveness wasn't my goal. Becoming worthy of it was. She told me that love isn't something you win back. It's something you become capable of giving. Nathan's voice cracked, but he pressed on. So I spent 2 years learning what I should have known from birth. I sat in circles with other men who'd broken their families and listened to them justify their destruction. I volunteered at shelters where I saw what threats like mine do to women, how they make them question their own worth, how they teach them to live in survival mode, how they poison every moment of intimacy with the fear of abandonment. The tears were flowing freely now, but Nathan's voice grew stronger. I learned that the threat I made wasn't about protecting my family's legacy. It was about my own fear of being unworthy of love. So, I tried to control it instead of earning it. I tried to possess it instead of nurturing it. I tried to demand it instead of becoming deserving of it. Nathan stepped closer to Amara, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried through the auditorium's perfect acoustics. Amara, I can't take back the words that shattered you. I can't undo the months when I made you feel disposable. I can't return the parts of your heart that I broke off and threw away, but I can stand here today and tell everyone that the man who made that threat is dead. The auditorium held its breath. I killed him slowly, deliberately, over 2 years of facing what I'd become. I killed the man who thought love could be threatened into existence. I killed the man who reduced you to your biological function. I killed the man who held our marriage hostage to his own insecurities. Nathan's voice rose again, carrying conviction like a hymn. And in his place, I've tried to build a man worthy of loving you not for what you can give me, but for who you are. A man who understands that love is a gift freely given, not a service to be demanded. A man who knows that your happiness matters more than my desires. Your dreams matter more than my expectations. Your peace matters more than my presence. Amara was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she listened to words she'd never thought she'd hear. I love you, Nathan said, his voice breaking completely. Not because you gave me sons, though they are miracles I don't deserve. Not because you might forgive me, though I pray for it every night. I love you because you are brilliant and compassionate and strong enough to survive my cruelty and still become a voice for women who can't speak for themselves. He reached toward her face, then stopped, his hand hovering in the air between them. I love you enough to walk away forever if my presence causes you pain. I love you enough to support your work, even if it means never seeing you again. I love you enough to want your happiness, even if it doesn't include me. The auditorium was electric with tension as Amara stepped forward, closing the distance between them. The man I married threatened me, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system. He made my love conditional on my performance. He reduced me to my utility instead of celebrating my humanity. Nathan's heart shattered as he prepared for her rejection. But then Amara continued, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. But the man standing here today has learned the difference between possession and love, between control and partnership, between demanding and deserving. Nathan's knees nearly buckled as he leaned into her touch. You broke something in me that night, Nathan. Something I thought could never be repaired. But watching you choose to become worthy instead of demanding to be forgiven, watching you help other women instead of just trying to win me back, watching you love our sons with no expectation of access to them that started to heal, wounds I thought were permanent. Amara's voice rose, addressing the audience as much as Nathan. This is what real change looks like. Not grand gestures or pretty words, but the daily choice to become better than who you were. Not demanding forgiveness, but earning the right to be forgiven. Not trying to reclaim what you destroyed, but building something entirely new. She turned to face Nathan fully, her eyes blazing with emotion. You can't have the old us back because the old us was built on a foundation of threats and conditional love. But maybe we can build something new, something based on choice instead of coercion, something based on mutual respect instead of power and control. Nathan's hands were shaking as he reached for her. Amara, are you saying? I'm saying that the man who threatened me is dead, she said firmly. And the man who took his place might be worthy of love, real love, the kind that comes without conditions or deadlines or ultimatums. She smiled through her tears, and it was like watching the sun rise after the longest night in history. I'm saying that maybe it's time to find out what marriage looks like when it's built on love instead of leverage. May I kiss you? Nathan asked, his voice barely audible over the thundering of his own heart. Yes. Amara whispered. Yes, you may. When their lips met, it wasn't the desperate kiss of people trying to recapture a lost past. It was the sacred kiss of two souls choosing to create something entirely new. Love born not from arrangement or obligation, but from the deliberate choice to cherish what you fought to become worthy of. The auditorium erupted in applause that shook the walls. But Nathan and Amara heard only the sound of hearts choosing love over fear, hope over pain, forgiveness over condemnation. When they finally broke apart, Nathan rested his forehead against Amara's, both of them breathing heavily. I want to come home, he whispered. We'll have to build a new home, Amara replied, her voice thick with emotion. One where love is never conditional, never threatened, never used as a weapon. One where our sons learn that real love serves instead of demanding, protects instead of possessing, celebrates instead of controlling. I'd like that more than my next breath, Nathan said. Then let's go home, Amara said. Let's go home and love each other the way we should have from the beginning. As they stood together on the stage where Amara had spoken truth and Nathan had found redemption, they understood that real love wasn't about recovering what had been lost. It was about becoming worthy of something infinitely better, a partnership built on mutual respect, unconditional love, and the revolutionary understanding that the greatest gift they could give each other was the freedom to be loved without fear. The applause continued as they walked off the stage together, hand in hand, toward a future they would build, not from the ashes of what had been destroyed, but from the solid foundation of who they had chosen to become. Love, they had learned, was not a transaction to be negotiated. It was a transformation to be lived,